My name is Cody Kraus, and I'm a real estate broker owner that's obsessed with everything real estate. Investing, building, selling, developing, farming, you name it. I've been doing this since I was 18 years old, and I've learned a ton through trial and error, and I've met some of the coolest people ever. This is a show where I invite these people on to talk about their experiences and mine, plus everything else real estate. Let's go. All right, well, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Everything Real Estate Show. Today, I wanted to cover a topic which I call the future of rental property in Canada. And what I wanted to do is essentially kind of look at how the strategies of owning rental property in Canada are changing by taking a look back at what they were 10, 15 years ago and what I think they're evolving into and or will be in the future moving forward. So let's start by taking a look back, say to 2015. I'm recording this video in 2026, so that's about 11 years ago. What people were doing at that time, at least my strategy was, and a lot of the people that I was listening to, the influencers in the industry, a lot of what my clients were doing at that time, the whole idea was they would buy single-family homes or semi-detached or townhomes or even condo units, and the whole idea was to get your mortgage payments covered plus a little bit of positive cash flow. And there wasn't a whole lot of appreciation in the market at the time. So essentially what they were trying to do was to get the property to be a positive carry, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. And the whole idea being, well, let's pay down principal over the next 15, 20, 25 years. And the whole idea being, once we get to retirement, we'll have paid for property that'll make us a passive monthly income. But then since then, obviously properties have appreciated a lot. There's been some changes in the Landlord Tenant Board that have severely affected the viability of a lot of landlords' plans for rentals moving forward. And so let's dive into it a little bit. Now, again, this might seem like a long time ago, but just back in 2015, I'll give you a real life example. I purchased a rental property for $104,000, and there was lots to choose from at that time. It was a story and a half home near the University of Windsor, and we did a little bit of improvements to it, refinanced it for around, I think, 125 or 130,000. And then at that time, we were hoping to get rent of, around $1,200, something like that. So we were using at that time what a lot of people called the 1% rule. And if I break down the 1% rule, essentially the idea was if we're buying a property for, let's make numbers really easy, $150,000, if you can get 1% of your 1% of your value that you paid for the property back in rent per month on a monthly basis, then it generally made sense. So if we dig into those numbers a little bit, again, we're looking at buying a house, $150,000 to get $1,500 per month in rent. So let's say that we financed the property by putting 20% down and getting a loan for 80%. And we're going to say that the loan was for 5% interest and it was over a 25-year amortization period. So we put our 20% down, we're financing $120,000, 5% over 25 years, that gives us roughly a monthly payment of $700. So again, we got rent coming in of $1,500, or at least projected what we're going to bring in, and then a mortgage payment of $700. Now obviously there's other costs to owning the property. So let's say that taxes and insurance together are around $350 per month. So maybe we're $250 a month on taxes, and we're $100 a month on insurance, so $350 a month. That brings us to $1,050 is our current carrying cost, just looking at mortgage, property taxes, and insurance. Now, if you've owned a home, obviously you know that there's other costs involved of owning a property. So let's say that it's another $150 per month that we set aside for maintenance, and we may not be doing maintenance every single month, but we want to put that money aside so that when we do have to do some maintenance, there's a little bit of cash there that we can draw on. So $700 a month for our mortgage payment. Again, we'll say $250 a month in taxes. We're going to say $100 per month in insurance, and then we're going to set aside $150 per month for maintenance and help account for a little bit of vacancy. I generally find that you should be setting aside around 8% of your projected annual income as vacancy. So plan to have your unit vacant 1 month per year. And if you don't have any vacancies for 3 years, amazing. But then you might have a vacancy that goes 3 or 4 months. And so that'll make up for that 8%. So if we put all those numbers together, that's $1,400 per month of projected costs. So $700 a month in mortgage payment, $350 a month for our taxes and insurance, $150 a month for vacancy and some maintenance, and that gives us an extra $100 per month, and we would call that our positive cash flow. Now, if you've owned these properties, again, that extra $100 may not be real cash flow that we're going to keep set aside. Personally, I would keep that $100 a month separate in a different account, just to add to our maintenance fund there, because even though we only have to do a roof once every 25 years, if we happen to buy the house in that 5 or 10 year hold period where it does need that roof, all of a sudden that average of $150 or $100 per month that we set aside for maintenance is going to be chewed up for a few years just in that roof replacement or furnace replacement that year. So essentially, in this scenario, we bought the home for 150 grand, financed 80% of it, and we're basically looking at a positive carry of maybe $50 to $100 per month. In reality, if you have to do a few larger improvements to the property, it might be break even or slightly negative carry. But that's when you could get 1% per month of the value of the home back in rent. It's not typically that you're actually going to see that in today's time. So that might seem possible thinking about it today. But again, my first rental home I purchased for 105 grand back in 2015. This is by the University of Windsor. And there wasn't bidding wars and people tripping over this property. You actually had a number of properties to choose from around that value and condition and things like that. And the thing is, the same home that I purchased for $105,000 back in 2015, which is 11 years ago, is selling now for about $360,000. So around triple the value that I paid for the property. Now, the same rent for that property would not be $1,500 or $1,200 or anything like that. The rent that you're looking at for that home would probably be around $2,200 or $2,400 per month. So if I purchased that property for $360,000, I'm now financing $300,000 of it, and the cost of servicing that debt is going to be more like $1,800 per month. And then once I add in the maintenance, the taxes, the insurance, the vacancy, everything else, you can see that the numbers just aren't adding up. So unless we're okay with purchasing a property and funding a negative carry, that's actually going to affect our personal lifestyle because we have to offset the losses from this property on a monthly or annual basis, it has more implications on our personal life than it used to when we purchased properties and all we had to do was come up with our down payment. And from a monthly ongoing cost of operation standpoint, it really didn't affect our lives a whole lot. Unless, again, there was a major repair coming up that we didn't have cash set aside for, or if all of a sudden we had a tenant that wasn't paying rent. Now, back in those days, a tenant that wasn't paying rent was more rare than it is today. And also the eviction process for non-payment of rent was a lot quicker. And we'll cover kind of why those terms have become more common, why non-payment has become more common, and why the time for evictions has taken a lot more time now and still takes a lot more time now. So I'll jump into that a little bit, but I just want to preface the conversation by saying it almost seems like a no-brainer when you could get 1%. 1% of your 1% of your monthly rent would account for 1% of your purchase price. That's how the numbers worked out. Again, you weren't getting rich overnight on it. Homes weren't appreciating like crazy on a monthly basis. They were maintaining their value and maybe going up 5% a year at that time. Again, you weren't getting rich off the passive income, but at least it was there so that it would carry the property, even if there was maintenance or periodic vacancies and things like that. So now all of a sudden, the cost of that same home is about triple, but the rents really maybe only doubled, not tripled. So what we started seeing was investors pivoting, and they started to look at different strategies. If all of a sudden single family homes or condos, oh, you know what, I should touch on condos, because condos wouldn't have had the same insurance costs, the same property taxes, and the same ongoing maintenance costs, but you could pretty much swap those out for the condo fee. The condo fee that you pay monthly to your condo corporation covers a lot of things like maintenance of the roof. So if it needs to be replaced or the elevators need to be serviced or if your exterior needs to be redone, that's often taken care of and planned for and accounted for in your condo fees. Also, the property taxes on a condo fee, even on a $150,000 condo versus a $150,000 home, taxes are much lower because you don't have a yard, you're using less municipal services, all that kind of stuff. And insurance is a lot cheaper because the actual structure's insurance is covered in your condo fee. So you're actually only insuring what they call studs in on a condo, and then your tenant still has liability insurance. So it really from most condos, it doesn't cost a whole lot more to own a condo versus a single family, because a lot of what you budget for in a single family is taken care of by the condo fee. And of course, that's on a case by case basis. Some condo fees have been poorly managed and they have terrible condo fees. Others have been maintained over the years and they're pretty reasonable. All right, so what I was getting to before I took the condo tangent there is that investors had to pivot as the prices rose. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to get into the market at the inflated prices. Now, if they already own the property, great. And a lot of times they would refinance it at today's value and try and figure out how to make more money out of the property. And that's when we started seeing things like basement suites or additional dwelling units, or another strategy with short-term rentals as opposed to your monthly and long-term rentals. And a lot of times people would see, maybe around a 50% per month rental bump. So if we were getting $2,400 a month on a single family home, if we could suite the basement and all of a sudden get $1,000 for the basement and maybe $2,000 for the main floor, well, now all of a sudden we're getting $3,000 per month instead of maybe 2,000 for the whole house. So we're getting a pretty good rental bump there. Or we switch to short-term rentals and we try and rent the house for $150 or $200 a night. We have a lot more vacancy, but we're looking at our rent on a daily basis instead of a monthly basis. And the other thing I'll add to that too is it's a lot more active management. When you're just renting out a house, you're going to get a lot less phone calls from tenants. When all of a sudden you have two tenants on one property, you're going to get calls about the neighbors upstairs are too loud, or the thermostats, in one unit, and so in the other unit it's cold or it's too hot. Or all of a sudden, hey, the other tenant, all of a sudden their girlfriend moved in and there's no parking in the driveway anymore and I have to park on the street. So you end up getting a lot more calls once all of a sudden you have a basement suite or an additional dwelling unit on the same property. And then similarly, once you switch to the short-term rentals, now all of a sudden we got to deal with the flips when the tenants are moving in and moving out, or the occupants, because you're using typically occupancy agreements instead of tenancy. And so, for example, when you're booking on Airbnb or Vrbo, there's often a cleaning fee. Well, now all of a sudden I got to arrange a cleaner to be there before and after, or if I want to increase my cash flow, I can handle that turn myself. But as you can see, that's a lot more active management. And there's always quirks when tenants move into a property. What day do I put the garbage out? What if I have to all of a sudden shut off the water for some reason? Or where, if you're doing a short-term rental, where are the towels? Do you have more towels? Do you have paper towels? Because I made a huge mess. Like, there's a lot more active management on the short-term rental side where a lot of your day-to-day problems have already been resolved the week that a tenant moved in if you're doing a long-term rental. So now, a lot of people are actually selling these properties and turning away from them to do the basement suiting legally. It got really expensive. So like pre-COVID, you might have been able to suite a basement for say $30,000 to $50,000. Now you're looking at suiting a basement could be $80,000 to $150,000. That's if you're doing it the legal route, making sure there's two means of egress, getting permits for it, closing those with the town or the city, all that kind of stuff. And the other thing with short-term rentals that's been really tough has been that there's a lot of tax implications on the property that people aren't aware of. So if all of a sudden the primary use of the entire property is short-term rentals, which operate under occupancy agreements and not tenancy agreements, or in other words, they're not someone's primary residence, there's HST implications. And if you talk to an accountant about this, they'll often tell you now you need to self-assess the property and pay HST on the value of the property at the time of the change of use. And then when you go to dispose of the property, if it wasn't self-assessed, someone's going to have to pay the HST implications. A lot of people have sold without considering these. If they ever get audited by the CRA, it's likely either the buyer or the seller is going to have to pay the HST, depending on how the contract was worded when the property was sold. So again, we had single family homes or condos where we were just dealing with one tenant. All of a sudden prices creeped up. Then we had to figure out how to get more rental income out of the same property. So we looked at basement suites or short-term rentals. But things started getting difficult around those because the prices to do the basement suiting or the tax implications of the short-term rental became encumbering on the landlord's life, just like having multiple tenants and other things like that. Two other byproducts of COVID that I'll add in here too, besides just the fact that, having renovations done on a basement started taking a lot longer, getting a lot more expensive, was that the condo fees ballooned like crazy with the inflation. Everything went up in value like crazy over a period of 5 years, and basically your labor rates of contractors have not come down. The cost of steel, if you got to replace your elevator, those things are still elevated to a very, very high rate. Same with windows and roofing and all that kind of stuff. So the cost of those things haven't come down, and often the condo fees had to be really ramped up to match those increases, or they haven't been ramped up yet, and the owners of a condominium are going to be subject to what's called a special assessment to cover the shortfalls and try and bring the condo corp into good standing upon the next review of it. Then the other thing that we went through was a really bad landlord tenant board scenario. So if you recall, during COVID, especially in Ontario, our premier Doug Ford got on camera at one point and said there's going to be no new rental evictions during this period of time. And what a lot of tenants heard was, I don't have to pay rent. That wasn't what he said, but that doesn't matter if that's what he said. People hear what they want to hear. And so when they hear there's no new evictions, they hear often, you can't evict me even if I don't pay rent. And what he actually said was no new evictions during this period of time. However, if you didn't pay your rent, the landlord can still make the application to begin the eviction process, but there wasn't going to be any orders or judgments on them until that period of time was done. So what might have taken 3 or 4 months before to evict a non-payment of rent tenant, we saw these timelines stretched to 8, 12. I had one rental where I did not receive rent for 16 months. So from 3 or 4 months up to 12 or 16 months, it became really tough for a landlord to hold a property when before, if we got 11 out of 12 months of rent, we were basically breaking even on a $150,000 property. Now to have a $360,000 property and potentially receive no rent for an entire year, you can see how that was crippling to landlords. And that's why a lot of people started exiting the business. Before, we were just looking at a monthly break even if we could come up with our down payment, pay down the loan over 15, 20, 25 years, and end up with a paid for asset that would give us passive retirement income. That was the whole idea. But now all of a sudden, 12 months without rent on a really expensive unit, and if we bought it at 360, it wasn't 20 or 30 grand that we had to come up with for a down payment. It was 60 or 80 grand when you include all the closing fees and things like that. So the implications on the landlord were much more substantial, as you can see, as the property values rose and the time for orders with the Landlord Tenant Board greatly grew. So a lot of landlords just exited. They looked at their lift and their equity, whether they bought it for 150 or 250 or 300 or even 350,000. They saw a lot of the changes in the Landlord Tenant Board. After COVID, we saw a spike in interest rates. So if all of a sudden they had to refinance the property at, say, 6% instead of 2%, there was just a lot of disincentive for landlords to keep the properties. So we saw a lot of people just going, this isn't worth it anymore. This isn't what I started doing when I was looking at this, in 2015 or in 2010. They looked at the lift in equity and said, why would I keep putting up with these headaches? I think it's just time to cash out and switch strategies. Now, that doesn't mean that investing in real estate is done. It changed. And so in 2022, CMHC, which is our Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, it's a crown corporation. I believe it's the only arm of the federal government that's actually profitable on an annual basis. They came out with a financing program called MLI Select. And what MLI Select is a 40 to 50 year mortgage term or amortization period for landlords of multi-unit dwellings. So if you're buying or building 5 units or more, if you applied to this program and were accepted, you could receive 40 to 50 year amortization mortgage, and it's insured, so that typically comes at a lower interest rate. And if you were building it, they even often offered terms like own your land and pay 5% of construction value. We'll finance 95% of it. So we had huge immigration at this time, if you recall, 2022, 2023, into 24. A lot of people coming in, a lot of landlords getting out of the business, but we need somewhere for this large level of immigration to live. So the government said, well, let's incentivize large multifamily construction. And so that's where you saw a lot of apartment buildings going up. And to the general public that was driving by these developments, you generally couldn't distinguish these from condominiums. So it was hard to tell if it was a new condo being built or if it was a new rental apartment being built. But if you never saw these units for sale and you just saw for lease signs out front, it's likely that it was a landlord slash developer landlord that was using the MLI Select program and taking advantage of a 50-year or 40 or 45-year mortgage amortization term with really appealing rental rates. They did have to qualify these built for purpose rentals. Often they had to be 10% less of market value rent. Often they had to have a certain amount of units that were accessible for handicap scenarios, all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of check boxes, including utility efficiency, all that kind of stuff that they had to meet. But if they met those terms and they were qualified borrowers, the government was willing to give them insured loans at very, very attractive rates. And so what a lot of people started doing, instead of being a landlord of a single family rental or a condo unit, was partner with someone in an MLI Select financed build or purchase, or instead of owning the properties directly, go buy shares in REITs, which are real estate investment trusts. Sometimes they're publicly traded, sometimes they're not publicly traded, but they can still sell shares in them. Some examples of these would be like Skyline or Canadian Apartment REIT. Locally, it's a lot more large builder developers that you would see, and they're not necessarily selling shares in them. But if I had $30,000 or $60,000 or $100,000 to invest, it'd be a lot easier for me to buy shares in a publicly traded REIT and benefit from owning those shares and maybe even getting a preferred tax rate on dividends rather than passive monthly income. And the other thing is my phone doesn't ring because tenants have a leak or because the tenants haven't paid rent or anything like that. They're professionally managed, and it's a lot more set it and forget it, buy the shares and just wait. And the other thing is you can buy these shares for these companies in a tax preferred account, right? So as a Canadian, if you're investing in your RSP or your TFSA or even your FHSA, your first time home savings account, home buyer savings account, you could buy shares for these REITs in those accounts, and so they're receiving preferred tax treatment from that basis too. So not only is it no longer active management, sure, you don't have direct title to the home, but you then get as a share owner in the property a lot of the benefits of owning real estate without the exposure to one tenant. It's multiplied over many. So if you have 1,000 units and 5 aren't paying rent, you're not as affected as much as if you have 2 units and one of them is not paying rent, right? We're only having 5%, or sorry, 1 or 5% of our tenants not paying rent versus 50. It's a huge difference. And so that's the appeal of buying shares in a REIT versus owning the asset directly. And then the other thing is the barrier to entry, right? If I have $30,000, there's not too many homes I can buy right now for $150,000, put my 20% down. But if I have $30,000, I can go buy $10,000 in shares in 3 different REITs, and all of a sudden now I have a whole bunch of diversity within my portfolio too. And the thing is, REITs exist not just for apartments, but you can buy asset class specific REITs. So, for example, mini storage. Another example is commercial or even industrial. There's REITs that exist for just specific property types too. And so if you didn't want exposure to, say, for example, just residential tenants in Canada, well, then you can expand to REITs that trade in different asset classes. And you can even look at different areas too, like the United States or others. So we saw people really have to pivot on their strategies. MLI Select allowed people to do that on the larger multifamily developments. And again, the barrier to entry grows every time the price points in the homes go up. So people had to diversify and look at different things, whether that was a partner or whether that was buying shares instead. And you know what? Maybe they just decided to get out of real estate altogether and trade stocks. Maybe some of them were stocks and REITs, or maybe they diversified by going into tech stocks or finance stocks, or they just looked at diversifying the portfolio altogether. So that's kind of 10 years ago, bringing us up to now. So the next question I want to answer is, what's the future of investing in real estate look like? And I believe that there's 2 main strategies moving forward. I think I see investors continuing to buy shares in corporations or building multifamily or commercial properties. So you're not going to have one person owning the majority or all the shares in one property. I think people are going to continue to appreciate the diversification of owning shares in multiple properties. I think we're going to see that a lot. And it might not always be through a publicly traded REIT. It might be a small private corporation. It might be 10 friends or 5 family members, or a group of professionals that get together. They create a corporation just to buy one commercial property or to buy a few apartment buildings. And you have your investors buy shares in that corporation that owns the whole thing. If they want to have direct ownership and control of the asset, versus when you're part of a REIT, you don't have direct control. The other thing I'll say about investing in a REIT, especially a publicly traded one, is that it's very liquid. When you own a single family home or a condo, or even a multifamily property or shares in a multifamily property, it's not a very liquid asset. There might be somebody living in the home. You don't know what the market conditions are going to be when it comes time for you to want or to need to dispose of that asset. When it comes to investing in a publicly traded REIT, you can just send an order button through on an app or call your financial advisor, and they can get rid of those stocks for you that day. Now, you are susceptible to the market volatility of that day that you want to sell it, but the point being is they're very liquid, and the cost of liquidity is very low, versus if I own an apartment building and I contract a realtor to list and sell the property for me. There's going to be some time on market. There's going to be commissions paid. There's going to be legal fees associated with it. When it comes to a REIT, there might be a commission with whoever you're buying or selling the shares through, but the overall cost to the transaction is low proportionately. So that's one strategy that's happening now, and I think that's going to keep happening moving forward. And again, there's benefits from a tax efficiency standpoint too. Passive income when you own real estate is typically taxed at 50% as a Canadian, whereas if you're receiving a dividend from a REIT, even that owns real estate, dividends typically receive a preferred tax treatment in the CRA's eyes. But I think another thing that we're going to see, oh, you know what? One other note that I made here on that note is I think you might even see some people not have a primary residence. And if they're living in an apartment building that they like, you might even see them investing in the REIT that owns the apartment building rather than buying a residential home. And I was just at a conference and I was speaking with some realtors from Toronto. One in particular, he actually had his condo up for sale right now. He purchased it in the height of the market in 2021. And he's looking to sell it now. It's in 2026. He was taking a look at offers that day, and realistically, when he does sell the property, he's looking at around $150,000 loss. And I said, well, that's got to create, it's unfortunate for you, obviously, the loss that you're going to realize, but that's got to create opportunity for somebody who's looking to get into the housing market right now in Toronto. For example, if my kids were looking to go to University of Toronto, or one of the colleges that are up there or something like that, I would think it would make sense at this point for me to buy a 2-bedroom condo for one of my kids to live in and then rent out the other bedroom to one of their classmates or friends. And he said, no, not really, because you can rent these same units for cheaper than the cost of ownership right now. So even though he might have purchased it for say $750 and right now it might be for sale for $600, he goes, do the math on the mortgage, do the math on the taxes, do the math on the land transfer tax, and especially in the city of Toronto, there's a double municipal land transfer tax. Do the math on all the costs of ownership, the maintenance over the period of the loan or the term of ownership, all that kind of stuff. It's way more than $3,000. It's probably closer to $4,000 per month, but you can go rent that same unit right now for $2,800 or $3,000 per month. So even though they have come down substantially, if you're looking at it from a purely cost of ownership versus cost of renting over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, you might still find better benefits in renting right now. So if that's the case, why not move into a REIT instead of an owned single unit condo and buy shares in the REIT? So if I was going to pay $2,500 a month for rent, an example, what if on an annual basis I put $30,000 a month, or sorry, $30,000 a year, which is $2,500 a month, into ownership of shares of the company that actually own the unit that I'm living in? Because if it was going to cost me, say, $2,500 a month to own that unit, well, there's still an additional, however much, $500 or $1,000 of costs that are uncoverable. I realize that some of that's going to go towards paying down your principal, but some of it's an uncoverable cost too, like your condo fees, like your insurance, like your mortgage interest, and all that kind of stuff. You might be a lot better off just renting that unit and buying the shares in the REIT that owns it rather than going out and buying the condo. Again, ideally we're paying down principal. The dream is always appreciation, but we can never be guaranteed appreciation. And the last 5 years are a perfect example of that. Now, here's the next thing that I think is going to be a trend in the market moving forward. I think that there are going to be some people that buy condos and they buy single family homes, and I think there's going to be three main profiles of them, and I'll cover what I think the three main profiles are. So one is that I think there's people that are going to purchase properties in secondary and tertiary markets. So for example, you might not be looking at London or Toronto or Kitchener or Windsor. You might be looking at markets like Chatham or Sarnia or um, Thunder Bay, or anyways, some secondary or tertiary markets. Maybe we're looking even past Niagara Falls, and we're going down the QEW all the way to Fort Erie or Port Colborne, around there. Um, and in some of those areas, you might be able to get closer to that 1% rule. I live in Kingsville, which is a small market outside of Windsor, and just next to us in Leamington and Wheatley, there's been some properties that have sold lately for around the $350,000 mark that are going to receive around $2,800 a month in rent. So that's not the 1% rule, but it's getting pretty close. And our interest rates have improved a fair amount over the last year. So you can get sub 4% mortgage rates on that right now. That's actually starting to look attractive to be in the single family or condo market as a landlord owning the single unit now. The caveat being good tenants that are on time with their rent. Because if all of a sudden we're not receiving rent for, even though the landlord tenant board's improving, it could still be 6-8 months. That could be crushing for people that can't afford that negative offset. Okay, so first profile was people that are looking to just be landlords in secondary or tertiary markets. The second is people that are going to buy cottages or recreational properties, and they want to use them personally, but they're going to rent them out on a short-term basis to help offset some of the carrying costs of the luxury of having a secondary home or a cottage residence. So maybe I look to, I know a place some people from here around go to is called Simcoe Lake, for example. It's much further north than here. Property values are quite low, and you're probably not going to rent it out over most of the winter unless there's some good snowmobiling around there and you get some people that want to rent it for snowmobiling. And they might go, okay, well, I can rent it by the week during the summer, and the income that I'm getting from renting it on a weekly basis during the summer is going to significantly offset my cost of holding. It's probably not going to pay for the whole thing. I don't think it's going to be a money-making scheme to own these things. But if I want to own the condo anyways, if I want to cottage, not condo, if I want a recreational property or a second property, well, at least getting some short-term rent off of that is going to help offset my cost of ownership. So first profile, your traditional landlords buying in secondary and tertiary markets. Second profile, people that want to buy a cottage or recreational property, short-term rental to offset the cost of holding. Now third, and I think this is going to be the most popular one moving forward, is parents that are concerned their children will never be able to buy homes. They've seen what the cost of housing has done over the last 10, 15 years, and they're concerned that the kids are never going to be able to move out of their basement. Or even that they're just never going to be able to own, even if they can go afford to rent. So, for example, I have 4 kids, and a thought that I'm having right now is it probably makes sense for my wife and I to have 4 condos or 4 single family homes, not because I think I'm going to make a ton of passive income on them right now, but I want to be able to see my kids have a home in the future. Now, whether I decide to sell the home to my kids at a discounted rate so that they can afford to enter the housing market, or I decide to become partners with them when they're old enough, when they become 18 years old, and we own the property together for a while until they can afford to buy it off me. Or maybe I'm in a position, my oldest is turning 9 this year, maybe I'm in a position, 9-10 years from now when I can say, you know what, I'm just going to give you the down payment of what the property was going to be, refinance it, put it into your name. Now, whether you want to live in the house as a primary residence or you want to continue owning it as a landlord, I just want to help my kids become homeowners. So I think that that's a big profile that we're going to see moving forward is parents that are just concerned their kids will never be able to become homeowners when they're of age, and therefore thinking proactively and buying one property to represent each child that they have now and holding on to it regardless of the negative carry. A lot of parents invest in, RESPs or education savings plans for their kids. I could see some parents also investing into real estate so their kids could become homeowners, or directing funds that they maybe would have put aside for education and calling it a real estate fund or a shelter fund for when the kids are of age. So that's kind of a look back on what landlording was 10, 15, 20 years ago in Canada, specifically in Ontario. Kind of where we're at in the market right now, which is a lot of investors leaving the market, shifting, pivoting strategies, going towards REITs, or maybe just getting out of it altogether. And then what I think it's going to be moving forward, and again, I think you're basically going to see two main silos, and one is large corporations buying portfolios and people investing into those corporations, and the other being parents that are concerned their children won't be able to afford housing and therefore taking precautions now. So anyways, I might be wrong. I'm totally open to it, but that's the trends that I've witnessed, that I'm currently seeing, and how I can see things starting to happen moving forward. I hope you got some value out of this today, and I'd love to hear your comments. So if you have anything that you'd like to talk about, or maybe concerns about what I've said, whatever it might be, reach out. You guys know how to get a hold of me. Thanks for listening. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the show, folks. Please keep in mind that this show is not offering legal, financial, or accounting advice, but rather opinions and experiences in the world of real estate from the host and the guests. If you're enjoying the show, please rate, review, and share with your friends and colleagues. And if you think that there's someone that needs to be on this show, please feel free to connect them with me. Or if there's a topic that should be discussed, feel free to let me know. Thank you so much, and bye for now.